I still get uneasy every time it rains at night, like something inside me remembers more than I want it to. This happened about a year ago, but the memory still comes back so clearly that I can almost smell the wet ground when I think about it. That night, the rain had already been falling for hours. It was one of those long, steady rains that never seem to stop, the kind that makes the whole neighborhood feel quieter than usual. I was alone in my house, just finishing some work on my laptop. The sound of the rain helped me relax at first, but after a while, the quiet started to feel too heavy, like the darkness outside was pressing against the windows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, but then the lights in my house flickered. Only once, but long enough to get my attention. I remember pausing and looking around my living room, listening closely. Everything was still, too still. Even the dogs in the area, who usually bark at everything, were silent that night. I kept working, but I felt this strange sense of being watched, even though I was completely alone. You know when you just feel something, even if you can't explain it? That kind of feeling. I tried to laugh it off in my head, thinking I was just overthinking because it was late and rainy, but the feeling wouldn't go away. After about an hour, I got up to make some tea. The kitchen window faces the backyard, and I usually like looking out while waiting for the water to boil. That night, though, the backyard looked darker than usual, almost like the rain had erased the shape of everything behind the glass. It was just shadows and moving water. I was staring outside without even realizing it, just lost in my thoughts, when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There was a shape near the fence. At first, I thought it was just a plant blowing in the rain, but the longer I looked, the more it seemed like a person standing there, not moving, just standing, completely still in the rain. I froze. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just my eyes tricking me. Maybe it was a tree or a jacket someone had left outside. The rain can make simple things look strange, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a plant, and it wasn't an object. It looked too tall, too solid. I turned away from the window for a moment, trying to control my breathing. When I slowly looked back, the shape was still there, still standing in the exact same spot. That was the moment I realized something was not right at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I was imagining everything. The rain made it hard to see clearly, and the glass kept fogging up a little from the warm air inside the kitchen. I wiped the window with my hand, hoping the clearer view would show me it was just a shadow or maybe a coat hanging on the fence. But when the fog cleared, the shape was still there, and it looked even more like a person now. I could see the outline of shoulders, and the way the figure seemed to be facing my direction made my stomach feel tight. I remember telling myself that maybe it was a neighbor who got stuck outside, or someone passing by who stopped to rest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. No one would stand perfectly still like that in heavy rain. I felt the urge to step back from the window, so I did. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure as I backed away. I didn't want to turn around and lose sight of it, because a part of me was scared that if I looked away for too long, something would change. I know that sounds strange, but that was exactly how it felt in that moment. I walked back to the living room and tried to calm myself down. I sat on the couch, but I couldn't relax. I kept listening to the rain hitting the roof, and every sound felt sharper than usual. My mind kept going back to the figure outside. Was it still there? Was it getting closer? The questions were making me nervous, so after a few minutes, I forced myself to check again. When I returned to the kitchen, I tried to prepare myself for whatever I might see. I approached the window slowly, feeling the floor creak lightly under my feet. When I finally reached the window and looked out, my heart dropped. The figure was closer, not by much, but it was no longer by the fence. It was standing a few steps nearer to the house, still facing me, still not moving. I felt a cold chill go from my neck down to my back. I knew for sure I had stepped away earlier, and the figure had been near the fence. Now it was halfway across the yard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to open any doors, and I didn't want to call anyone because I wasn't even sure what I would say. Who would believe me if I said there was someone standing in my backyard during a heavy rainy night, not moving, and somehow getting closer without making any sound? I stayed in the kitchen, staring, afraid to look away again. Minutes felt like hours, and the rain kept falling without stopping. The figure never moved. It just stood there in the middle of the yard, And then, something happened that made everything even worse. I kept staring at that figure, hoping it would disappear or prove itself to be something harmless. But the longer I watched, the more I felt this heavy pressure in my chest, like my body already knew I was in some kind of danger. It was strange how silent everything felt. Even with the rain falling, the whole world outside looked empty except for that figure, standing there like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I stepped back from the window, keeping my eyes on the shape as long as I could. I felt like if I blinked or turned my head, something would change again. My hands were shaking so much that I had to hold the edge of the counter just to steady myself. I remember trying to breathe slowly, but the air felt tight, like the room wasn't giving me enough space. After a few seconds, I forced myself to move away from the kitchen. I didn't want to stand near the window anymore. I went to the living room and turned on another light, even though it barely helped. The house felt too quiet, and I couldn't stop thinking about how the figure had moved without making any sound at all. I thought about calling someone, but I stopped myself again. I didn't want to sound dramatic, and I didn't want them to think I was imagining things. A part of me kept trying to believe there was a normal explanation, even though everything inside me said there wasn't. I kept pacing around the living room, trying to figure out what to do. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the kitchen, even though I didn't want to go near the window again. Finally, I convinced myself that I needed to check. I needed to know if it was still there, or if it had moved again. So I walked back to the kitchen, moving slowly, trying to control my breathing. Right before reaching the window, I stopped and listened. I didn't hear anything outside, not even the usual sounds the rain makes when it hits the ground. It was too quiet. I leaned forward and looked through the window. The figure was gone. I felt my whole body freeze. It wasn't near the fence. It wasn't in the middle of the yard. It wasn't anywhere. Just empty space and falling rain. For a moment, I thought maybe it had been something imaginary all along. Maybe the rain had created an illusion and I scared myself. I almost convinced myself of that, until I noticed something that made my heart drop so fast it felt painful. There were footprints in the mud, fresh ones. They led from the yard straight toward the area near my back door. When I saw those footprints, I felt this sudden wave of fear that made my legs feel weak. The prints were clear even through the rain, spaced in a way that showed each slow, deliberate step. They didn't wander around or turn in any other direction. They went straight toward my back door, as if whoever or whatever had been standing out there already knew exactly where to go. I stepped back from the window, moving quietly, even though I knew it didn't matter. My house felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in on me. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but my mind kept imagining the worst possibilities. I didn't know if the person was hiding somewhere outside, or if they had already reached the door when I wasn't looking. I walked toward the back door, but I didn't get too close. I just stood a few steps away, listening. The rain was still falling, but even that sound felt distant. I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. The door looked normal, but the thought of someone standing just on the other side made my hands feel cold. I checked the lock without touching the handle. It was still in place. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if I had locked it earlier. I usually do. But that night, I had been so tired that I couldn't trust my memory. The idea that I might have forgotten made my heart beat faster. I slowly walked back to the living room, trying to think clearly. I knew I didn't want to stay near the doors or windows, but I didn't want to go to my bedroom either. The house felt too open, like someone could be watching me from anywhere. I grabbed my phone, planning to call someone, but I stopped again. I didn't want to stand there trying to explain something I didn't even understand myself. A few minutes passed, though it felt much longer. I kept listening for any sign that the person had returned, but there was nothing. No movement outside, no sound on the floor, no shadow passing by, just the rain. I told myself I needed to be brave enough to check one more time just to make sure no one was near the door. I walked back to the kitchen, moving slowly so I wouldn't panic. I went toward the window again and looked down at the yard. The footprints were still there, leading straight to my door. But now there was something else, a faint shape near the edge of the yard. Hard to see through the rain, but I could make out enough to understand. Whoever had been there earlier was standing at the far corner, facing the house again, as if they had returned to watch. I couldn't see their face, but their posture was the same as before, completely still. It was like they wanted me to know they were not gone. And the worst part is that I never saw them leave. I never heard a single sound. Even now, whenever it rains at night, I feel that same pressure in the air, like something is waiting just outside. I don't know who or what it was, and I never want to know. I just remember the feeling of being watched, and how the quiet rain made everything so much clearer and so much more terrifying. I want to share something that happened to me on a rainy night not too long ago. Something I still have trouble talking about. It felt so real, and even now, whenever the weather gets dark and quiet, I feel that same heavy pressure in my chest. I keep telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know it wasn't. It was late in the evening, and the rain had been falling since the afternoon. Not a storm, just a steady rain that never stopped, the kind that makes every sound softer, like the whole world is muffled. I was alone at home because my family was out of town, so the house already felt a bit too quiet. I thought the rain would make me feel calm, but instead it made the air feel a little heavier, a little colder. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake. The lights were warm and soft, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But then I noticed something strange. Even though the rain was hitting the roof and the ground outside, I could barely hear anything. It almost felt like the sound had been lowered around my house, like someone had turned the world down. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, but the silence felt unnatural. Usually, on a rainy night, you can hear cars passing, water flowing, insects chirping, or at least the wind. But that night, nothing. Just the faint sound of rain, and even that seemed distant. I tried not to think too much about it and went to the kitchen to get a drink. When I reached the window above the sink, I stopped for a moment. The backyard looked darker than usual. The rain blurred everything, turning the whole view into a shadowy mess. I stared out for a bit, trying to adjust my eyes, and for some reason, I felt this strange sense of discomfort. I didn't see anything strange, but something in me felt unsettled. I shrugged it off and went back to the living room. I sat down, and after a few minutes, that uneasy feeling returned. It felt like something outside was paying attention to me. I couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, like a soft pressure on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting stronger. I looked toward the hallway that led to the back of the house, and the air felt slightly colder there. It made me think of the kitchen window again, and even though I didn't want to, I felt this urge to check outside one more time, just to make sure everything was normal. When I walked back into the kitchen, the feeling grew stronger. I approached the window slowly, my heart beating a little faster. I wiped the glass with my hand because it had fogged up slightly, and then I saw it, a shape standing near the far end of the yard. It was so still that for a moment I thought I was looking at a shadow, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was something standing there, tall, unmoving, facing my direction. That was the moment my whole body went cold. I kept staring at that shape, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rain made everything blurry, but I could still tell it wasn't a tree or anything else that should have been there. It looked like a person standing with their shoulders slightly forward, facing the house. The stillness bothered me the most. No normal person would stand like that under heavy rain, not even for a minute. I felt my breathing get tight, so I stepped back from the window. I didn't want to turn around because I was scared that if I looked away for too long, it would move again. My hands felt cold, and I remember pressing my palm against the countertop just to steady myself. I told myself not to panic, that maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Rain can make things look different. Maybe it was just something left outside, something harmless. But deep down, I didn't believe that. After a moment, I forced myself to walk back to the living room. I turned on another light, hoping it would make me feel safer, but instead the extra light only made the house feel emptier. The silence from outside was still there, and the more I listened, the more it bothered me. It didn't sound like a rainy night. It sounded like everything outside was holding its breath. I sat down on the couch and tried to distract myself with my phone, but I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. My mind kept replaying the shape I saw. I wondered if it was still there. I wondered if it had moved. The thought of it standing out there in the rain made me feel sick to my stomach. After a few minutes, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I needed to check again, even though I didn't want to. So I stood up and walked back toward the kitchen, moving slowly, listening carefully with every step. The air felt colder the closer I got, and I could feel that uncomfortable pressure building in my chest again. When I reached the window, I stopped for a moment. I didn't want to look. I almost turned back, but curiosity mixed with fear pushed me to lift my eyes and stare through the glass again. The shape was closer, not by a big distance, but it wasn't at the far end of the yard anymore. It had moved several steps forward, still facing the house, still standing completely still in the rain. I didn't hear anything earlier. No footsteps, no movement. It was just suddenly closer, as if it had been waiting for me to look away. I felt a wave of fear so strong that it made my knees feel weak. I stepped backward until I reached the middle of the kitchen. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly. My mind kept trying to come up with a normal explanation, but nothing made sense. Why would someone stand outside in the rain like that? Why would they move silently? And why would they be facing my house, watching through the window? I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call anyone because I wasn't sure how to explain it. I didn't want to sound frightened over something I couldn't fully see. But at the same time, I didn't feel safe at all. I stayed there, frozen, staring at the window as the rain kept falling. And then something happened that made the fear even worse. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the window, trying to convince myself that everything was going to be fine. I kept watching that shape, hoping it would move away or fade into the rain. But it didn't. It just stayed there, like it had all the time in the world. My hands were shaking, so I held them together to steady myself. I remember thinking, maybe I should just leave the kitchen and pretend I didn't see anything. But the thought of turning my back made me feel even more uneasy. It felt like something would change the second I stopped looking. After a moment, I forced myself to step away from the window. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes on the shape as long as I could, until I reached the living room again. I sat on the couch, but I couldn't relax. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears, and the quiet outside made the whole house feel strange. The rain was still falling steadily, but it didn't match the heavy feeling in the air. I tried to stay calm. I even turned on the television, hoping the sound would help me feel less alone. But the noise only made my nerves worse. It felt like the sound didn't belong in the room, like I was forcing normal life into a situation that had already become far from normal. I kept glancing toward the hallway again and again. My mind kept whispering, "Check the window," even though my body didn't want to move. After several minutes, the pressure became too much. I had to know if the shape was still there. So I got up once more, even though every step felt heavier than the last. As I walked toward the kitchen, the air felt colder than before, as if the temperature had dropped around me. I slowed down near the window, standing just out of view for a moment, listening. Nothing. No movement outside. No sound except the rain. That silence made my chest tighten. I finally leaned forward and looked through the glass. The shape was gone. A chill ran through me so quickly that I had to put a hand on the counter to steady myself. It wasn't at the far end of the yard. It wasn't closer to the house. It wasn't anywhere I could see. The entire yard was empty, except for the rain hitting the ground. For a few seconds, I tried to tell myself that maybe it had been a trick of the rain after all. Maybe I had scared myself for nothing. But then I noticed something that erased every bit of comfort I was trying to build. There were footprints in the wet ground, fresh ones. They led from the middle of the yard straight toward my back door, each step clear in the muddy surface. They weren't faint or vague. They were sharp and recent, as if made just moments before I looked out. And they stopped right at the edge of the door. I stared at them without moving, feeling my heartbeat pounding harder with every passing second. I had no idea where the person went after that. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. They just vanished from the yard. But the footprints told me one thing clearly. They had come right up to the house. I stood there staring at the yard, trying to keep my breathing steady, even though every part of me wanted to hide. The shape was gone again. One moment it had been standing closer to the house, and the next it had vanished into the rain. I kept looking from one corner of the yard to the other, hoping I had simply missed it. But there was nothing, just darkness and falling water. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe the stress of being alone had made me see something that wasn't really there. I wanted to believe that so badly. I almost managed to convince myself until I felt something shift in the air around me. It was subtle, but I felt it, like the quiet in the house had changed. I backed away from the window and walked toward the living room again. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, but I couldn't stop thinking about how silently it had moved. If it could get closer without making any sound, it could be anywhere now. That thought made me move even slower, as if sudden motion would draw something toward me. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the hallway that led to the kitchen, trying to listen for anything unusual. I didn't hear footsteps outside. I didn't hear doors or windows, just the distant, muffled rain. But there was this heavy feeling building in my chest, like something was watching me again. I forced myself to stand up and check the back door from a distance. I didn't go too close. I just looked at the handle and the frame to make sure everything was still in place. Nothing looked disturbed, but something didn't feel right. It was the kind of discomfort you feel when you know someone else is in the same space as you, even if you can't see them. After a moment, I slowly walked back to the kitchen window. I didn't want to, but some part of me needed to know if the shape had returned. When I reached the window, I hesitated before looking out. I felt this cold sensation along my spine, warning me that I might not like what I saw. Still, I lifted my eyes and looked through the rain. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were clearer than before, even with the water running across the ground. Fresh impressions in the mud, leading from the middle of the yard right up to the steps near my back door. They hadn't been washed away yet, which meant they were recent, very recent. I scanned the yard again, heart beating fast, expecting to see someone standing there. And then I saw it. The shape had returned, but this time it was standing at the far edge of the yard, in a slightly different position than before. Still facing the house, still silent, still perfectly still. It hadn't left at all. It had just moved in and out of sight, almost like it wanted me to keep checking, like it was aware of my fear and wanted to make sure I didn't relax. It felt intentional. Even now, I can remember the exact posture of that figure, the way it stood there without moving, the way the rain slid down its outline without revealing any details, the feeling that it was waiting for something, watching, studying. I stepped back from the window slowly, not wanting to turn my back on it too quickly. My hands were shaking. My breathing felt uneven. I wanted to call someone, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. That was the last time I looked at it that night. I couldn't bring myself to check again. I locked myself in my bedroom, turned on every light, and stayed awake until morning. When the sun came up, I finally gathered the courage to look outside. The yard was empty. The footprints were gone, washed away, and there was no sign that anyone had ever been there. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. And even now, whenever a rainy night gets too quiet, I feel that same pressure in the air, like something out there remembers me. There is something about rainy nights that makes everything feel heavier. The air feels thicker, the house feels quieter, and every shadow seems a little darker than usual. I used to like the sound of rain because it helped me relax. But ever since this happened, I get uneasy whenever I hear it late at night. It brings back memories I wish I could forget. This happened a few months ago, on a night when the rain had been falling since the afternoon. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, never-ending rain that made the whole neighborhood feel calm in a strange way. I was alone at home because I had sent my family to stay with relatives for a couple of days due to some repairs we planned to do. I stayed behind to take care of a few things. At first, the night felt normal. I had dinner, watched a bit of television, and then sat in the living room scrolling through my phone. The lights in the house were warm, and the sound of rain outside blended into the background. Everything seemed fine until I noticed that it was unusually quiet. I know that sounds odd, but the silence felt different. Even though the rain was steady, it sounded faint, like it was far away instead of right outside. I turned off the television and listened carefully. All I could hear was my own breathing and the mild sound of water outside. No cars, no voices from neighbors, not even the usual hum of insects that sometimes survive the weather. It felt unnatural, like the night was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it and went to the kitchen to wash a few plates. While standing at the sink, I glanced at the window above it. Normally, I don't pay attention to the backyard at night because it always looks gloomy under the rain. But something made me look a bit longer this time. The rain blurred most of the view, but the yard looked darker than usual, like the shadows had piled up in the corners. I kept staring for a moment without even realizing it. I didn't see anything strange, but the feeling of discomfort grew stronger. It was the kind of feeling where your body senses something before your mind does. I shook my head and told myself that maybe I was just tired and overthinking. I returned to the living room and tried to distract myself again, but the strange quietness was still there. After a while, I began to feel like something outside was watching the house. I know that sounds dramatic, but that was truly how it felt. Not like danger was coming, but like something unknown was patiently waiting. I tried to brush it off, but I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. The air felt cooler there, heavier. My stomach dropped a bit, and for reasons I still can't explain, I felt the urge to check the backyard again. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but my feet moved on their own. I walked back to the kitchen and approached the window slowly. The glass was slightly fogged, so I wiped it with my hand. For a moment, I didn't see anything, just rain and darkness. But right as I was about to step away, I noticed something near the edge of the yard. A shape. It wasn't moving. It wasn't leaning. It was just standing there, dark, tall, and too solid to be a plant or shadow. The moment I realized it looked like a person, a cold feeling spread through my entire body. I stayed at the window longer than I should have, just staring at that shape through the rain. The longer I looked, the heavier the air inside the kitchen felt. It was the kind of feeling where your body reacts before your mind does, like something deep inside knows you should not be standing there. I stepped back slowly, trying not to make any sound, even though I knew the person outside could not hear me through the rain. I kept watching the window as I moved away from it, afraid that if I blinked, the shape would be closer. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I kept telling myself that maybe it was something simple, maybe someone cutting through the neighborhood, maybe someone sheltering near the far end of the yard. But none of those explanations matched the way the figure stood, completely still, facing the house, as if it already knew I was watching. I walked back into the living room and turned on another light, even though it barely helped. The house felt too open. Every corner looked darker than usual. I tried sitting down on the couch, but my mind kept drifting back to the kitchen window. I couldn't relax. I couldn't focus on anything. That uneasy pressure on the back of my neck stayed with me, making it hard to breathe normally. A few minutes passed before I realized I was listening for something. I didn't even know what. It was just a quiet, uncomfortable waiting. The rain outside wasn't loud enough to cover the strange silence that surrounded the house. I could hear my own breathing more clearly than the weather, and that was the part that bothered me the most. Rainy nights are supposed to sound alive, but that night felt like everything had paused. I finally stood up again because the silence was making me more nervous than the thought of looking outside. I walked toward the kitchen hallway, my steps slow and careful. As I got closer, the air felt slightly colder, like the temperature had dropped only in that part of the house. I can't explain it, but it felt wrong. I reached the kitchen window and paused. I tried to prepare myself before looking out, hoping the figure would be gone, hoping I could convince myself it had just been an illusion made by the rain. But when I looked, the figure was still there, and it wasn't in the same place. It had moved closer to the house, not a huge distance, but enough that I knew it had taken several steps forward. Enough that I could see the outline more clearly now. Shoulders, head, the way it stood, straight and unmoving, with all its attention pointed toward me, felt my chest tighten. I didn't hear anything earlier. I didn't hear the ground shift. I didn't hear footsteps in the rain. It was just suddenly closer, as if the moment I stepped away from the window, it decided to come forward. I swallowed hard and stepped back again, my hands shaking slightly. I didn't want to stay in the kitchen any longer, but as I turned toward the hallway, I realized something even more unsettling. The silence outside had become heavier, almost like the rainy night itself was holding its breath again. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm myself, but my mind kept going back to the feeling that the house no longer felt like my house. It felt like something was sharing the space with me, even if I couldn't see it. I kept telling myself not to panic, but every part of my body felt tense. I slowly stepped away from the window and returned to the living room. I sat down, but I couldn't relax. My legs wouldn't stop shaking, and every time I breathed, I felt the air catching in my chest. I kept staring toward the hallway, as if expecting something to appear there. After a few minutes, I told myself I had to check again. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't sit still without knowing if the shape was still there. Part of me hoped it had disappeared. Another part feared it would be even closer. I walked back to the kitchen, moving carefully like the floor might give me away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I reached the window, I stopped right in front of it and lifted my eyes slowly. The shape was gone. At first, I wanted to believe that was a good sign. Maybe it really had been someone passing by. Maybe they realized they were at the wrong place and left. But the more I stared at the empty yard, the more uneasy I felt. It didn't feel like someone had walked away. It felt like something had simply vanished without leaving a trace. I forced myself to take a closer look. That was when I noticed the ground. The rain was still falling, but the mud near the center of the yard had clear marks in it. Footprints. They started from where the shape had been standing earlier. And they were not leading away from the house. They were leading toward it. The prints stopped near the area beside my back door, where the rainwater flowed more slowly. I couldn't see anything standing there now, but the idea that something had walked across my yard made me feel dizzy. I stared at the back door for a few seconds, barely breathing, waiting for anything, any sound or movement, but nothing happened. The door was closed, but suddenly it felt way too thin. I felt exposed just being in the same room with it. I stepped backward until I reached the hallway. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to leave, but I was scared that moving too much would draw attention. I felt like someone was still out there, watching the house from just out of sight. I kept listening, waiting for any sign that the person had returned to the yard. But the rain kept falling in that strange, distant way, and the silence felt heavier than before. I tried to convince myself that I was still safe inside, but deep down, I knew that something was not over yet. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, trying to calm myself, but every part of me felt tense. I kept telling myself to breathe slowly, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I knew the shape had moved earlier, and the idea that it could move again without any sound made everything feel worse. The rain outside felt heavier, like it was covering something I wasn't supposed to hear. I forced myself to look out the window again, even though I didn't want to. My hands were shaking a little, and I could feel the cold from the glass before I even touched it. When my eyes finally adjusted to the darkness outside, I felt a sharp chill spread across my entire back. The shape was gone. It wasn't near the yard. It wasn't near the tree. It wasn't anywhere in view. The entire backyard looked empty, except for the steady rain falling across the ground. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that this was a good thing, that maybe whoever it was had left. But that hope disappeared fast when I noticed the ground. There were footprints in the wet soil, not scattered or random, but in a straight line, and the line led from the yard directly toward my back door. I stepped backward without thinking. My heart felt like it was beating too loudly, and every part of me felt alert. I stared at the door, afraid that the handle might move at any moment. I didn't know if the footprints were fresh or if they had been there for a few minutes. I just knew they hadn't been there when I first looked outside. I stayed completely still, listening for anything at all. The silence felt wrong again. The rain outside sounded faint, almost like it was trying not to disturb the air around the house. I kept watching the door, afraid that if I looked away, something would change. After what felt like a long time, I glanced back at the window again, and even though the yard was dark, I saw something that made my entire body freeze. A tall shape, barely visible through the rain, standing near the very edge of the yard. It was farther than before, almost blending into the darkness, but I could still see the outline. It was facing my house, as if it had stepped back after reaching the door. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know whether it had been standing close to the door just moments earlier. I didn't know if it had walked back silently. I didn't even know if it had ever truly left the yard. All I knew was that it was still there, and it wanted me to know it. I slowly backed away from the window and stayed in the living room the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, too scared to turn off the lights, I sat there until morning, waiting for the sound of the rain to fade, waiting for the sky to get brighter. When the sun finally came up, the yard was empty. No shape, no footprints, just wet grass and silence. I still have no explanation for what I saw. I don't know who or what it was, but every time it rains at night, I feel that same heavy pressure in the air, like something is standing quietly in the dark, waiting for me to look outside again. There is something about rainy nights that still makes me uneasy, even now. I always liked rain when I was younger, but after what happened last year, everything feels different. Whenever the sky gets dark and the rain starts falling in that slow, steady way, I feel this strange pressure in my chest. Like my body remembers something my mind tries so hard to forget. It happened on a night when I was alone at home. The rain had been falling since the evening, not too heavy, but constant enough to cover the whole neighborhood in this soft, blurry haze. The streets were quiet, and the only lights came from the street lamps that reflected on the wet ground. Normally, I would enjoy that kind of atmosphere, but that night felt different right from the start. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to relax before going to bed. My family was away for a few days, so the house was completely silent, except for the faint sound of rain. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, but a few moments later, that peaceful feeling slowly turned into something else. I didn't know why at first. It was just this small feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was just the air. It felt heavier than usual, the kind of heaviness that makes you pause without even realizing it. I kept listening to the rain, but the longer I listened, the more I noticed how strange the silence around it felt. On rainy nights, you can usually hear so many other sounds. Cars passing, neighbors talking, animals moving around outside. But that night, it felt like the whole world had gone quiet, like everything outside my house had stopped. I tried to ignore it and went to the kitchen to get something to drink. When I reached the window above the sink, I casually looked outside. The backyard was completely dark, except for a small bit of light from the living room shining onto the wet grass. The rain made everything look like it was melting together, shapes blending into each other. I stood there for a moment, sipping my drink, but then I felt something, a sense that I wasn't supposed to be standing there. It was such a strange, uncomfortable feeling. Nothing was happening, nothing was moving, but something about the darkness outside felt aware, like it was paying attention to me. I told myself I was just overthinking. It was late, I was alone, and rainy nights always felt a bit eerie. So I stepped away from the window and went back to the living room. I tried watching a video on my phone to distract myself, but I couldn't shake that weird feeling from earlier. It stayed in the back of my mind like a soft warning. After a while, the rain began to fall a little harder. I could hear it hitting the roof in the yard outside. But again, everything else was silent. No animals, no cars, no voices, just rain. Something about that silence bothered me so much that I felt like I needed to check outside again. I don't know. Why? Maybe I hoped seeing everything was normal would make the feeling go away. Maybe I wanted proof that it really was just a quiet night. So I got up and walked back toward the kitchen. The closer I got to the window, the stronger that uneasy feeling became. But I still pushed myself to look outside. I wiped a little fog off the glass, and that was when I realized I wasn't imagining anything at all. There was a shape near the far end of the yard, not moving, not shifting with the rain, just standing there. I stood there at the window much longer than I meant to, trying to convince myself that I was simply tired. Rain can change the way things look, and sometimes your eyes fill in details that are not really there. That is what I kept telling myself, even though my stomach felt tight and my hands were cold. After a moment, I stepped away from the glass. I did not want to keep staring, because a part of me was afraid that if I watched too closely, I might see something I was not ready for. I went back to the living room and sat down, but the calm feeling I wanted did not come. The rain outside sounded softer than before, almost like it was fading into the background, leaving the quiet inside the house even heavier. I tried to scroll on my phone again, but I kept losing focus. Every few seconds, I found myself looking toward the hallway that led to the kitchen, like my mind was drawn back to the window even when the rest of me wanted to stay far away from it. I kept thinking about the shape I saw. I tried to picture it as something harmless, but the memory of how still it looked made that impossible. After a few minutes, the discomfort grew too strong. I needed to know if the shape was still there. Even though fear was building inside me, the idea of not checking felt worse. So I stood up and walked down the hallway again, slower this time, paying attention to every small sound inside the house. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped right before the window. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, wiping the glass with my hand again to clear the fog. The shape was still outside, but it was not in the same place as before. It had moved closer to the house, not by a large distance, but enough for me to notice right away. It stood near the middle of the yard now, facing the window in a way that made me feel exposed, like the rain had not blurred it as much as earlier. I felt a strong sense of fear rise through my chest. My first thought was that I did not hear anything. No steps, no movement, not even the soft shift of someone walking through wet grass. One moment it had been farther away, and now it was right there, silently standing in the rain. I stepped back from the window slowly, keeping my eyes on the shape as long as I could. A part of me wanted to run to the living room and hide, but another part wanted to make sure it did not get closer while I was not looking. I tried to stay calm, but the silence from outside made everything feel wrong. I kept telling myself that a normal person would call out, ask for help, or at least move in a natural way. But this figure did none of that. It simply stood there, facing the house, as if it had no reason to move at all. And then, without warning, something about the air inside the kitchen changed. I did not hear anything unusual, but the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the house itself was reacting to whatever stood outside. That was when I realized I needed to decide what to do next. I stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what was happening. My mind kept telling me to calm down, to look at everything carefully, but my body felt tense, like it already knew something was wrong. I kept my eyes fixed on that same spot in the yard, hoping the shape would fade or show some sign that it was harmless, but it didn't move at all. I stepped back from the window again, slower this time. I felt like any sudden movement would make things worse, even though I had no idea what worse meant in that moment. My hands felt colder than before, and my breathing became slow and shaky. I went back to the living room and sat down, but I couldn't relax. I felt like I was listening for something without even knowing what I was waiting for. Every part of the house felt too quiet. The rain was still falling outside, but the sound was so soft that it did nothing to calm my nerves. The silence felt almost heavy, like it was pressing down on the walls. I kept glancing at the dark hallway that led to the kitchen. I didn't want to go back there, but my mind wouldn't let the memory of that shape go. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand up. I needed to know if it had moved again. The not knowing was worse than anything I could imagine. So I made my way toward the kitchen, trying to stay calm, even though my heart felt like it was pounding harder with every step. When I reached the window, I took a breath before looking outside again, and that was when everything inside me froze. The shape was no longer in the middle of the yard. It was closer, much closer. It stood several steps away from the house now, still facing me, still not moving. The rain fell around it, but the figure didn't react in any way. No shifting, no raising of shoulders, no movement of the head, just complete stillness, like it was waiting for me to notice again. My legs felt weak, and I had to grab the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. I didn't understand how it got that close without making any sound at all. I didn't understand why it was moving only when I wasn't looking. The whole situation felt unreal, yet everything in me knew it was real. Too real. I backed away from the window and moved toward the living room again. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want to think. I felt like the house was no longer a safe place. I felt like the walls weren't enough to protect me. I sat down again, trying to breathe slowly. I kept thinking that maybe I should call someone, but the thought of explaining what I saw felt impossible. I wasn't even sure what I saw. All I knew was that someone, or something, was standing in my yard in the rain, getting closer every time I looked away. I tried to gather my thoughts, but before I could calm myself, something outside changed again. A small detail at first, but enough to make my heart drop straight to my stomach. I stood there staring at the window, trying to calm myself, but the fear kept growing no matter how much I tried to steady my breathing. The figure had already come much closer before, so the idea that it could move again while I wasn't looking made me feel completely helpless. I didn't want to stay in the kitchen anymore. Every part of me felt exposed. I slowly stepped backward until I reached the hallway, keeping my eyes on the window as long as I could. Once I was far enough, I turned and walked toward the living room again. The lights in the house felt too dim, even though they were the same lights I used every night. It was like the whole place had become unfamiliar, as if something had changed in the air. I sat on the couch for a moment, trying to convince myself that the figure wouldn't come any closer. Maybe it had just been standing there by accident. Maybe it was someone passing by. Maybe I misread everything. But then the image of those earlier movements appeared in my mind again, the way it had silently changed its position without any sign, the stillness, the direction it faced. None of that felt normal. After a while, I realized I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to know if it was still there, or if it had moved again. The thought of checking made my stomach twist, but the idea of not knowing felt worse. So I stood up and slowly walked back down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I stopped and listened. The rain was steady, but the silence around it was still strange. I felt that pressure in the air again, that uncomfortable sense that something outside was aware of me. I stepped closer to the window, moving very slowly, almost afraid to breathe. When I finally looked outside, I felt my whole body tense. The figure was gone. At first, I felt a tiny wave of relief, but it didn't last even a second, because the rain was hitting the ground hard enough to wash away anything. Yet the mud leading toward the back of the house showed something clearly. Fresh footprints, not old ones, not faded ones. They were recent, still sharp at the edges. They came from the middle of the yard and stopped right near the area where my back door stood. My heart dropped. I didn't know if the door was locked properly. I didn't remember checking it earlier. I suddenly felt terrified to even approach it. What if someone was on the other side? What if they were standing there completely silent, the same way they had been in the yard? I backed away from the window again. I didn't dare go near the back door. I stayed in the center of the house, holding my phone, unsure whether to call anyone or not. I kept listening for any hint of movement, but the silence was too deep. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was waiting. After what felt like hours, the rain finally started to lighten. The pressure in the air eased a little, but the fear stayed. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just waited, sitting with the lights on, listening carefully to the quiet. In the morning, I checked again. The footprints were still there, clear as ever, but there were no prints showing someone walking away. Nothing leading back toward the fence. Nothing showing an exit, just the ones that came toward my house. I still don't know who or what it was. I never saw a face. I never heard a sound. But every rainy night since then, I can't relax. I keep feeling like something is watching from outside, waiting for another chance to come closer. I want to tell you something that happened to me on a rainy night a little while ago. I still think about it sometimes, usually when I'm alone and the weather feels the same. It was one of those nights where everything felt a little too quiet, a little too still, like the whole world was holding its breath. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but it did, and it changed the way I feel about rainy nights forever. It started around 9 in the evening. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and calm at first, but by night it had become heavier, not loud or wild, just thick and constant. The kind of rain that makes the outside world look blurry, like everything is melting into the shadows. I was at home alone that night, sitting in my living room with the lights turned low, just trying to enjoy the peaceful sound of the weather. At least, that's how it felt at first. After a while, I realized something strange. Even though the rain was falling hard, it didn't sound right. Usually, you can hear it clearly on the roof, the ground, the trees, everything. But that night, the sound felt distant, almost muted. It was like the rain was happening far away, even though I could see it coming down just outside my window. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it stayed in the back of my mind. I kept glancing around my house, noticing how quiet everything felt. Too quiet. Sometimes silence can feel peaceful, but this wasn't that kind of silence. This one made me tense without fully knowing why. I got up from the couch to stretch my legs and decided to walk to the kitchen for a drink. When I reached the sink, I looked out through the window without really thinking. The yard was dark, only lit by the dim reflection of the house lights behind me. The rain made everything look soft and shapeless, like the whole backyard was fading into the darkness. I don't know why, but I kept staring. Maybe I was waiting for my eyes to adjust. Maybe I was trying to find something familiar to calm myself. But the more I looked, the stranger it felt. The air outside didn't look right. The space felt heavy, like there was something out there taking up more room than it should. I shrugged the feeling off and went back to the living room. I sat down, tried to watch a video, tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong outside. The quiet felt unnatural, and the rain sounded like it was being muffled by something I couldn't see. Eventually, curiosity got the best of me. I stood up again and walked slowly back toward the kitchen window. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to check the yard again, but there was this uneasy pressure building inside me that I couldn't ignore. When I looked out the window the second time, my stomach tensed immediately. Something was standing near the far end of the yard, a tall shape, completely still, facing my direction. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew it wasn't there before. I stayed frozen for a few seconds, still holding the edge of the counter, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything. I wanted to believe it was just a shadow or maybe something in the yard that looked different because of the rain. But the image stayed in my mind so clearly that I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there. I stepped away from the window and walked back to the living room. The house felt unusually quiet, and the rain sounded softer than before, almost distant. I sat down for a moment, but my mind kept going back to the shape I saw. I tried to tell myself to relax, but every part of my body felt tense. I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. It felt like something was waiting there, even though I knew the space was empty. After a few minutes of trying to calm myself, I realized I couldn't just sit there and wonder. I needed to check again, just to make sure. So I stood up and walked slowly back to the kitchen. My steps felt heavier than usual, and my breathing grew a little uneven the closer I got. When I reached the window, I didn't look right away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the floor, telling myself not to be scared. Then, when I felt ready, I lifted my head and looked outside. The shape was still there, but it wasn't in the same place. It was closer. Not right against the house, but definitely closer than before. It looked like it had moved several steps forward. I didn't hear anything, not a single sound. It was just suddenly nearer than before, standing in the same still position, facing the house. I felt a cold wave of fear run through me. My hands started shaking again, and I stepped back without taking my eyes off the window. I didn't want to run, but I didn't want to stay near the glass either. The figure outside didn't move. It didn't shift or sway. It just stood there, watching. I tried to think of reasons for someone to be out there. Maybe someone had gotten lost or needed help. But if that were the case, they would have called out or tried to get my attention. They wouldn't just stand there in the rain, staring at the house without moving. The longer I watched, the more my fear grew. I couldn't understand why it was there or how it had moved without making any sound. I didn't want to call anyone and justify something I couldn't explain. But I also didn't want to stay close to the window. I slowly backed away and returned to the living room, my heart beating too fast. I sat down again, but this time, I didn't try to relax. I just listened to the silence, waiting for something to change. And then, after a few quiet moments, something did. I stayed frozen for a long moment, trying to calm myself. But the fear kept building in a slow, heavy way. It wasn't the kind of fear that jumps at you. It was the kind that crawls up quietly, making you notice every small sound, every empty corner, every shift of air. I tried to breathe slowly, but my body felt tense, like it already knew something was very wrong. I stepped away from the window, keeping my eyes on it even as I moved. I didn't want to turn my back on the yard, not after everything I thought I saw. I went to the living room again and stood near the doorway, listening carefully. The whole house felt different. You know how sometimes a place you know well suddenly feels unfamiliar? That was exactly how it felt. Almost like the air inside had changed, heavier and colder. For a few minutes, I just stood there, not sure what to do. I didn't want to look outside again, but at the same time, the idea of not knowing what was happening bothered me even more. I had this strange feeling, like the quiet around me was waiting for something, waiting for me to look again, waiting for me to react. I walked back to the kitchen slowly. My steps felt louder than usual, even though I knew I wasn't making that much sound. The rain outside was still falling, but it didn't comfort me at all. It just made everything feel more distant. I reached the window and stopped before getting too close. I let myself breathe for a moment, then leaned forward to look out again. The yard looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the emptiness felt unnatural. My eyes scanned everything carefully, searching for the shape I had seen before. I didn't see it anywhere. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe it never existed, that maybe the rain had made me think I saw something that wasn't real. But then I noticed something near the middle of the yard. The ground was disturbed. There were clear marks in the wet soil, not footprints exactly, but deep impressions, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I followed the marks with my eyes, and the trail led straight toward the side of the house, disappearing where the shadows were darker. My heart started beating faster. I looked toward the side window, the one that faced the narrow space between my house and the fence. I couldn't see anything from where I was, but I felt this strong sense that something was there. Standing close, standing too close. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood in the kitchen, staring at the side of the house, waiting for any sound or any sign of movement. The rain kept falling. The silence stayed heavy, and then I felt it. A slow, cold awareness that something was no longer outside. Something felt like it was already near the walls of my house. I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself that I was imagining everything. But the longer I stared, the more real it all felt. My heart was beating so hard that it almost felt loud in the quiet house. I didn't want to move, but I forced myself to step away from the window. I needed to put some distance between myself and whatever was out there. I walked back toward the living room, keeping my breathing slow because I was scared of making any sudden sound. My mind kept replaying the shape, the slow movement, the way it stood so still. I tried to sit on the couch, but I couldn't relax. My body felt too tense, too aware of every small noise inside the house. After a few minutes, I gathered enough courage to check one last time. I kept telling myself that maybe it had left. Maybe it was all some strange moment that would disappear once I looked again. So I walked back to the kitchen, feeling that same cold pressure around me. I approached the window slowly, holding the edge of the counter for support. When I looked outside, the shape was gone. I should have felt relieved, but instead, my fear got worse. The yard looked empty, but something felt wrong. I leaned forward just a little, trying to see more clearly through the rain. That was when I saw it. There were footprints in the wet ground, deep, clear ones. They led from the far end of the yard straight toward my house, step by step, all the way to the area near the back door. I felt my hands start to shake. I didn't want to believe it, but the footprints were right there, fresh, leading directly to my door. I stepped back from the window so quickly that I almost lost my balance. I stared at the hallway that led to the back of the house, afraid to even breathe too loudly. I didn't hear anything from outside. I didn't hear anything inside either. The quiet was so heavy that it made the house feel colder. I checked the back door from a distance. It was closed, but I couldn't remember if I had locked it earlier. I didn't want to go close enough to check. I didn't want to go anywhere near it. I stayed in the living room for the rest of the night, too afraid to move. I kept every light on and sat facing the hallway so I could see if anything changed. The rain continued until early morning, soft and steady, like it had been trying to hide every sound outside. When the sun finally came up, I gathered enough courage to check the backyard again. The footprints were still there, though the rain had softened them. But they were real. They had been real the entire time. I never found out who or what had been out there that night. I never saw a face or a clear figure, but the fear I felt was real. And even now, whenever it rains at night, I feel that same uneasy pressure in the air, like something could be standing out there again, waiting, just like before. I want to tell you about something that happened to me on a rainy night not too long ago. I still think about it sometimes, usually when the weather turns quiet and heavy the way it did that night. I know it sounds dramatic, but the memory still makes me uncomfortable, like a part of me remembers more than I want it to. It started on a Saturday evening. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and constant. Not loud, not stormy. Just that slow, calm rain that usually makes people feel relaxed. I was alone at home because my family had gone on a short trip. and I decided to stay behind since I had a lot of things to finish. I thought the quiet would help me focus, but as the night went on, the silence felt a bit too strong. I was sitting in the living room with the lights on, trying to watch something on my laptop. The house felt normal at first, but after a while, I noticed how unusually silent everything outside sounded. Usually during rain, you can hear cars passing through puddles or someone walking by under an umbrella. But that night, there was nothing, just the sound of rain, and even that felt distant, like it wasn't really touching the ground near my house. The air inside felt still. I remember pausing my video and just sitting there, listening. I couldn't explain why, but I felt uneasy. Not scared, just slightly uncomfortable, like something was different, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried to ignore the feeling and went to the kitchen to get something to drink. When I opened the fridge, the cool air felt strangely strong against my face. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, hearing the faint sound of rain from the window. I walked toward the sink and glanced out the glass, mostly out of habit. That was when I noticed something that made my chest feel tight for a second. The backyard looked darker than usual. The rain made everything blurry, but there was a certain heaviness to the darkness that didn't feel right. I couldn't make out the usual shapes clearly. The plants, the small storage shed near the corner, even the fence felt like it had blended into the shadows. I stared longer than I meant to. I don't know why, but I felt like I was supposed to, like something out there deserved a second look. My eyes kept trying to adjust to the darkness, searching for anything out of place. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, after a few seconds, I noticed a faint shape near the far end of the yard. It wasn't clear enough to understand, just this tall form that didn't match anything that should have been there. I leaned slightly closer to the window without realizing it. The shape didn't move. It didn't shift or sway with the rain. It was just there still, as if it had been standing there for a long time. A cold feeling crawled through my body, slow and uncomfortable. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, or maybe a shadow created by the rain. But something deep inside me felt alert, like my instincts were trying to warn me about something. I stepped back from the window, suddenly aware of how quiet the house felt. That was the moment I realized the uneasy feeling wasn't going to go away. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me the entire time. It was strange because nothing dramatic had happened yet. It was just a rainy night, an empty house, and that quiet atmosphere that felt a little heavier than usual. Still, something in the air made me feel like I should pay attention. I tried to focus on my phone again, but I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. I didn't know why I felt drawn to look there. Maybe it was because the air coming from that direction felt colder, or maybe it was because the lights in the living room seemed slightly dimmer on that side, even though I knew they were normal. After sitting there for a while, I finally stood up and walked toward the kitchen. I didn't have any real reason to go back there, but the curiosity was stronger than my fear. Something about the quiet outside made me want to check the window again, like a small voice in my mind kept saying, "Just make sure." I moved slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I reached the kitchen, the room felt colder than the rest of the house. I could hear the rain more clearly there, but even that sounded softer than it should have. I walked toward the window, and for a moment, I just stared at the reflection of the room behind me. I felt hesitant, like my body already knew something I didn't want to learn. Finally, I wiped the fog on the glass and looked out. There was something at the far side of the yard. At first, it didn't look like much because the rain blurred everything together, but when I leaned closer, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was more like a shape. Something tall but not detailed enough for me to recognize. It stood completely still, almost blending into the darkness. I tried to convince myself it was just something left outside, maybe a large object I never noticed before. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. There was something about the way it stood, something too deliberate, as if it wasn't just sitting there by accident. It felt like it was facing the house, facing me. I stepped away so fast that I almost tripped on the edge of the counter. My heart was beating too quickly, and I felt this cold sensation spreading through my back. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, trying to calm down, but the feeling only grew stronger. I told myself not to look again. I really tried, but after a few minutes, I slowly turned back to the window. The shape had moved, not a tiny shift or a slight angle. It was clearly closer than before, bringing it further into the light from the kitchen window. It was still standing, still facing the house, still extremely still. I had no idea how it moved without me hearing anything at all. That was when I realized something was seriously wrong. I stood in the middle of my living room for a long moment, trying to calm my breathing. I kept telling myself that maybe I was only imagining everything, that the rain and the darkness were confusing my eyes. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the uneasy feeling stayed. It felt like something outside was aware of me, as if it had been watching me long before I noticed it. I decided to walk back to the kitchen again, even though I really did not want to. My curiosity and fear were fighting each other, but in the end, fear made me move slowly, taking small steps, listening to every tiny sound around me. The air felt heavier than before, almost like the house had grown colder in just a few minutes. When I reached the window, I stopped right at the edge of the kitchen floor, afraid to get too close too quickly. I tried to look out from a distance first, but the rain made it hard to see anything. So I took one more step and leaned forward carefully. The yard looked empty. For a second, I felt a little bit of relief. I told myself maybe the figure I saw earlier was never a person. Maybe it was just my mind creating shapes out of shadows and rain. Maybe the fear had made everything worse than it actually was. But as soon as that small relief settled in my chest, I noticed something on the ground that made me freeze completely. There were footprints, clear ones, leading from the far end of the yard toward my house. They were spaced apart in a calm, steady pattern, as if someone had taken their time walking across the wet ground. The sight of them made my whole body tense. It proved I had not imagined anything. Something had been there. Something had crossed my yard. I felt a cold wave of fear rush through me. I did not see the person anymore, but the footprints showed how close they had been. They stopped only a short distance away from where the light from my kitchen window reached the ground. I slowly stepped backward, feeling my heart beat faster and faster. I wanted to get away from the window, away from any place where someone outside could see me. I moved back into the living room, breathing carefully so I would not panic too quickly. I kept thinking about one thing. If the figure had walked toward my house, then where did it go after that? The yard was open. I would have seen new footprints if the person had walked away, but there were none, only the ones coming forward, which meant the person had not walked back into the darkness. They had stopped somewhere close, or worse, they had moved somewhere I could not see. I stayed frozen in the middle of the hallway, unsure what to do next. I kept listening carefully, hoping for some clear sign that everything outside was normal again, but the house felt too quiet. Even the rain sounded strange now, almost like it was coming from far away, instead of right outside my walls. I felt this heavy awareness, like I wasn't alone anymore, even though I couldn't see anything inside the house. After a moment, I gathered some courage and stepped slowly back into the kitchen. I stopped a few steps away from the window because I was scared of what I might see, but I also knew I couldn't just stand there doing nothing. My mind kept going in circles, imagining every possibility, and none of them made me feel safe. I leaned forward a little and looked through the glass again. The yard was empty. There was no shape, no movement, nothing unusual. The footprints I had seen earlier were still there, but the figure itself was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stared for a long time, trying to find any reason to believe I wasn't losing my mind, but the yard just looked silent and dark. With the rain falling steadily, I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a strong sense of discomfort. It didn't make sense for someone to appear and disappear like that, without any trace. I kept thinking about how close the figure had gotten to my house, and how still it had been. No normal person behaves like that. I stepped away from the window and looked toward the back door. I didn't want to get too close, but I stared at the handle for a long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had stood there earlier, just on the other side. I imagined someone quietly waiting, listening to me move around inside the house, and that thought made my hands feel cold again. I checked the lock one more time, and then I walked back to the living room. I turned on every light I could, even the ones I usually never use. The bright lights didn't make me feel safer, but at least they kept the shadows away. I sat on the couch, holding my phone, trying to decide whether I should call someone or just wait until the rain stopped. I didn't end up calling anyone. I was too scared that they would think I was imagining the whole thing, and I didn't want to sound confused or dramatic. So I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching the windows and listening for any sign of movement outside. Nothing else happened, but that heavy, uncomfortable feeling stayed with me until the sun finally came up. When the morning light filled the yard, I went to the kitchen again. The footprints were gone, washed away by the rain. The yard looked normal, as if nothing had ever happened there. But I remember how my stomach twisted when I thought about that shape standing still in the dark, closer every time I looked away. I still think about that night, whenever it rains. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window longer than I should, wondering if I'll see that same shape again. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely, but I know what I felt. I know it was real, and I know it was watching me. I want to tell you about something that happened to me on a rainy night a few years ago. I've tried to forget it many times, but every time the sky gets dark and the sound of rain starts to fill the air, the memory comes back to me, piece by piece. I am not trying to convince anyone to believe me. I just need to get it out of my head, because keeping it inside has been eating at me for too long. That night, the rain had already been falling since the afternoon, but around evening it became heavier. The kind of rain that makes the whole neighborhood look blurry. I lived alone back then in a small rented house at the edge of the town. It was not a fancy place, just a quiet spot where I could focus on work and rest after long days. I usually liked the sound of rain because it helped me relax, but that night it felt different. It felt like the rain was hiding something instead of calming everything down. I remember feeling a little uneasy for no real reason. I tried to distract myself by watching videos, reading messages, doing anything to make the time pass. But my focus kept slipping, and I kept glancing toward the window even though the curtains were closed. I could not explain it. It was just this uncomfortable awareness, like someone else was in the house with me, even though I knew I was alone. Around midnight, the power went in and out a few times. It was not a complete blackout, just short flickers that made the lights dim enough to make the room look unfamiliar for a moment. Every time it happened, I felt a small chill in my chest. I told myself it was just the rain and the old wiring in the house. Still, the feeling kept growing slowly, almost like the air was becoming heavier. At one point, I paused the video I was watching and sat quietly. I do not know why. I just felt like I needed to listen. The rain was steady, the wind was soft. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the uneasy feeling did not go away. If anything, it got stronger, sitting deep in my stomach. After a while, I decided to go to the kitchen to get some water. And that was when I first noticed something that made my skin crawl. The floor near the hallway looked a little wet, not like I had spilled something, not like condensation. It looked like someone with soaked clothes had stood there for a long time and then walked away. But I knew I had not been outside at all. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wet marks on the floor. They were faint, but very clear, almost like the shape of footsteps, but not sharp enough for me to be sure. My first thought was that maybe the roof had a leak, but the ceiling above that spot was dry. I reached up and touched it just to be certain, and there was not a single drop. The rain outside kept falling steadily, but inside the house, everything felt still, too still, like the air was waiting for something. I followed the damp trail with my eyes and saw that it continued toward the living room. My heart was starting to beat harder, and I could feel my palms getting cold. Even then, I kept telling myself that there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe I stepped there earlier with wet slippers. Maybe the humidity was high and caused the floor to look damp. I tried to list every possible reason so I would not panic. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized I had not stepped anywhere near that spot since the afternoon. I slowly walked toward the living room, trying to stay calm. Every step I took felt heavier than usual, like the air was pressing down around me. The living room looked the same, nothing out of place, but the trail stopped right in the middle of it, not near a window, not near the door, just in the center of the room. By then, the uneasy feeling had turned into something stronger, a quiet fear that settled into my chest. I kept looking around, trying to see if something had fallen or if an animal somehow slipped inside, but everything was just as I left it. I decided to check the front door, thinking maybe I had not closed it properly. But when I reached it, the door was locked and the handle was dry. The floor near the entrance was dry as well, which made no sense at all. If someone had come inside, there would have been water there too. I remember standing still by the door, listening again. The rain filled the silence, steady and distant, but not soothing. The house felt colder than before, even though the windows were all closed. I started to feel this strange awareness, like someone was watching me from somewhere I could not see. When I turned around to look back at the living room, I noticed something that made my breath stop for a moment. The damp spot in the middle of the room looked slightly larger than before, almost like someone had just been standing there again. I stared at that spot for a long time, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the lighting had shifted. Maybe the floor was reacting to the humidity. I kept repeating those thoughts in my mind, but none of them felt honest. Deep down, I already knew something was seriously wrong. I just did not want to admit it to myself. I slowly stepped closer to the living room again. The air felt even colder now, almost like I had left a door open somewhere, but I knew everything was shut tight. I placed my hand near the damp area without touching it, just to feel if there was any cool draft. There was nothing. It was just cold because the whole room felt cold. I backed away and sat down on the edge of the sofa, unsure of what to do next. I kept glancing at the hallway, half expecting to see more damp marks appear out of nowhere. The house was small enough that I could see nearly every corner from where I sat, yet the feeling of being watched kept growing. It was not loud or sudden. It was slow and steady, like someone standing behind you without touching you, just close enough for your body to sense it. I tried, turning on the television to distract myself, but the moment the screen lit up, the power flickered again. The light dimmed just enough to make the room feel even more unfamiliar, and then it steadied. I sat there in silence, the television still loading, and felt this strange tightness in my chest. It was as if something in the house did not want noise, did not want light, did not want me to do anything except sit there and notice it. After a while, I forced myself to stand up. I told myself I would go back to my bedroom, lock the door, and just wait until morning. That felt like the safest option at the time. But as I turned toward the hallway again, something caught my attention. The damp marks were no longer just in the living room. There was now a long, faint streak leading toward the bedroom hallway. Not solid footprints, not anything sharp or clear, just a vague path of moisture trailing in that direction. I knew for a fact that the hallway had been dry earlier, because I had stared at it for minutes trying to calm myself down. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to walk closer. Every step felt slower than the last, like my body was trying to hold me back. I kept thinking about leaving the house altogether, but stepping out into the heavy rain in the middle of the night felt even more terrifying. I thought staying inside would be better, but when I saw where the trail ended, that thought disappeared. The wet streak stopped right in front of my bedroom door, and the door, which I was completely sure I had left open earlier, was now slightly closed. Not fully shut, but pushed enough that I could not see inside. I stood there in the hallway, staring at my bedroom door. It was not fully closed, just pushed enough to hide whatever was inside. The small gap between the door and the frame felt darker than the rest of the house, as if the light refused to enter that space. I kept telling myself not to overthink it, that maybe I had closed it without remembering, but every part of me knew I had left it open. The rain outside kept falling steadily, but from where I stood, it sounded distant, almost muted. The house felt too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like the only sound left in the world. I took one small step toward the door, then another. I do not even know why I kept moving. Curiosity, fear, some strange instinct that told me I needed to see what was waiting inside. When I reached the door, I felt a coldness on my skin, deeper than the rest of the house. Not wind, not moisture, just a cold presence that made my breath feel thin. I slowly pushed the door open with my fingertips. The room was dark, but I could still make out the shape of the bed, the desk, the shelves. Everything looked exactly the same as earlier, but the floor near the foot of the bed was wet, as if someone had been standing there for a long time, dripping on the wood. I did not step inside. I just stood at the doorway, Staring at that wet patch, I felt this heavy pressure in the room, like something was waiting for me to come closer. My eyes kept adjusting to the darkness, and for a few seconds, I thought I saw a faint outline of a person by the corner of the bed. Not clear, not detailed, just a dark shape that did not match anything I owned. My body refused to move any farther. I slowly backed away, step by slow step, keeping my eyes on that corner. The shape did not move, but the cold feeling grew stronger, almost like it was filling the hallway behind me. When I finally reached the living room again, I grabbed my bag, my phone, anything within reach, and went straight to the front door. I did not care about the rain anymore. I stepped outside without looking back, letting the water drench everything I carried. The moment I left the house, the pressure in my chest loosened, and the cold feeling faded just enough for me to breathe normally again. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's place. I did not explain what happened. I just said my house felt strange, and I did not want to sleep there. The next morning, when I went back, the floor was dry. The room felt normal. Nothing looked disturbed. But the memory of that cold presence has stayed with me every rainy night since. Sometimes, when the weather is heavy and the sky is dark, I still feel like something from that night followed me quietly, not close enough to be seen, but close enough for me to sense. I want to share something that happened to me on a rainy night a couple of years ago. I have never told this story to anyone in full, mostly because I know how unbelievable it sounds. Still, every time the weather gets dark and the rain starts to fall steadily, the memory becomes so clear that it almost feels like it is happening all over again. Maybe writing it down will help me understand it better, or at least make it easier to carry. At that time, I was renting a small house on the edge of town. It was quiet, simple, and a little old, but it was affordable and close enough to my job. I used to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere, especially when it rained. There was something comforting about hearing the rain on the roof. But the night I am about to talk about changed the way I feel about rainy weather completely. The rain had started in the late afternoon and gradually became heavier as the evening went on. By the time it reached midnight, the entire neighborhood felt wrapped in a curtain of water. The streets were empty, and most houses around me had their lights off. Everything felt calm on the surface, but inside my house, the atmosphere felt strangely tense. It was not anything obvious. It was just this quiet, uneasy feeling that kept tugging at the back of my mind. I had been sitting on the sofa watching videos, trying to relax after a long day. The sound of the rain usually helped me wind down, but for some reason, it made me feel more alert instead of sleepy. Every few minutes, I found myself pausing the video and glancing toward the windows or the hallway, even though I had no reason to. It felt like the house was slightly colder than usual, but not in a dramatic way, just enough to make me notice. Then the lights began to flicker a little, not enough to go completely out, just enough to make the room change tone for a moment. I remember sitting there, holding my breath without meaning to, as if waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The lights settled again, and the house went back to that quiet, tense stillness. I thought maybe I was just tired, so I decided to get up and stretch for a minute. When I stood and walked toward the kitchen, something caught my eye. On the floor near the hallway, there was a small patch of moisture. It looked fresh, like someone had just walked through that spot with soaked clothing. I stopped right away. I had not gone outside at all that night, and there was no open window or leaking pipe that could have caused it. At first, I tried to brush it off and tell myself it was just condensation or maybe water I had not noticed earlier. But the longer I stared at it, the more it bothered me. It was too clear, too recently formed. I did not feel scared yet, but the quiet uneasiness started to grow into something heavier. I walked a little closer, still trying to convince myself it was nothing. The floor around that spot was completely dry, so it did not make sense for moisture to appear only in that one area. I crouched down to look more closely, and that was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The damp spot was not just random. It had a slight trail leading toward the living room, like someone had taken a few slow steps and then stopped. I stood up again right away. My first instinct was to check the front door, but it was locked securely, just like I remembered. The handle was dry, the floor by the entrance was dry. Everything was exactly how it should have been. That only made the whole situation feel more confusing. I went back to the living room and tried to calm myself down. I kept telling myself that maybe I had spilled something earlier and forgotten about it. Maybe some water from my shoes had dried in a strange pattern and only became visible again because of the humidity. I listed every ordinary explanation I could think of, even though none of them felt right. The rain outside continued falling steadily. Usually the sound relaxed me, but that night it felt heavier, almost like it was pressing against the walls of the house. The air inside felt colder than before, enough for me to notice it on my skin. I grabbed a blanket and sat on the sofa, hoping the feeling would pass, but it did not. After a few minutes of trying to distract myself, I noticed something else. The living room felt different, not visibly, not physically, just the atmosphere. It felt like someone had been there recently, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the same quiet way you can tell when someone has just stepped out of a room. A faint presence, a small shift in the air. I tried turning on the television to break the silence, but the moment the screen lit up, the lights flickered again. This time it lasted a little longer, enough for me to see the room dim into a strange, muted shade before brightening again. I felt a deep chill run through me, the kind that starts slowly and spreads through your whole body. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself and looked toward the hallway again. The damp spot I had seen earlier was still there, but now it seemed slightly larger. I could not tell for sure, but I felt absolutely certain that it had spread. That was the moment I finally realized something was wrong. Not confusing or unusual. Wrong. The kind of wrong you feel in your gut, even if you cannot explain why. I stood up again, slowly, deciding I should check the rest of the house just to feel safer. But when I stepped closer to the hallway, I noticed something that made my breath freeze for a moment. There was now a faint, extended streak of moisture leading farther into the hallway, as if someone had walked deeper into the house. I stared at that faint trail for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The streak was light, almost hard to notice unless you were looking closely. But once I saw it, I could not look away. It led deeper into the hallway, toward the part of the house that always felt a little darker, even during the day. I felt this hesitation in my chest, like my body was warning me not to follow it. But at the same time, I knew I could not just ignore it. If I stayed in the living room pretending nothing was wrong, the fear would only get worse. So I took a slow step forward. The floor felt cold under my feet, colder than usual, and the silence inside the house felt heavier with every movement I made. As I walked down the hallway, I kept glancing at the doors on both sides. I did not hear anything, but I could feel something. It was like the air around me was thicker, and every breath felt slightly harder to take. The rain outside continued to fall steadily, but the sound of it felt distant, almost as if the house was separating itself from the outside world. The trail of moisture stopped in front of my bedroom door. I stood there quietly, looking at the door and trying to remember if I had closed it earlier. I was almost sure I'd left it open, because I rarely closed it unless I was sleeping. But now it was partly shut, just enough that I could not see inside. A cold feeling spread down my back. I did not want to touch the door, but I also knew I could not just stand there and do nothing. I reached out slowly, placing my hand on the surface. It felt colder than it should have been, not freezing, but cold enough to make me pull my hand back for a moment. I took a deep breath, held it without realizing, and pushed the door open just enough to see inside. The room was dark, but I could still see the outlines of everything. My bed, my desk, my shelves. Everything was exactly where it should be. Nothing looked moved or disturbed, but the floor near the foot of the bed was damp, just like the trail in the hallway. A clear, fresh patch of moisture, as if someone had been standing there for a while before stepping out into the hall. I did not walk inside. I stayed in the doorway, staring at that spot. The silence in the room felt different from the rest of the house. Heavier, thicker, like the air was holding something in place, waiting for me to notice it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started feeling this quiet, growing pressure, almost like someone was standing inside the room but staying out of sight. I could not see anyone, but the sensation was strong enough to make my hands turn cold. I stepped back slowly, keeping my eyes on the room the entire time. I did not want to turn my back on it. I felt like if I did, something might move, even if I could not see it. When I finally reached the living room again, I felt a wave of relief, but it did not last long. The coldness in the air was still there. The sense of a presence did not fade. It felt like something had followed me out of the hallway, staying just far enough behind that I could not see it, but close enough for me to feel it. I stood there in the center of the living room, unsure of what to do next. I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to calm myself, but the fear kept growing in this slow, steady way that felt almost deliberate. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, constant, and close. I could feel it behind me, beside me, around me, even though I could not see anything at all. The rain outside kept falling in the same steady rhythm, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt distant, like it was happening in a different world. Inside the house, everything felt heavier, colder, and strangely alive. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but every part of my body felt tense, as if preparing for something I could not name. I glanced at the hallway again. The darkness there seemed deeper than before, as if the light from the living room could not reach it fully. I wrapped my arms around myself and took a slow breath, trying to think clearly. Staying still felt impossible, so I decided I needed to leave the house, even if it meant stepping out into the rain in the middle of the night. I reached for my bag and phone on the table. The moment I touched them, I felt that strange pressure again, almost like someone was standing directly behind me. I froze. I did not dare turn around. I just stayed there, gripping my things tightly, waiting for the feeling to fade. But it did not fade. It stayed, steady and cold, like someone was inches away from me. That was the moment I realized I could not stay there any longer. I moved toward the front door without looking back. My steps were slow at first, but the feeling behind me grew stronger, pushing me forward. When I reached the door, my hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to undo the lock. I could feel the air behind me grow colder, almost touching my back. The moment the door opened, the sound of the rain rushed in, loud, real, full of life. It felt like the first normal thing I had heard in hours. Without thinking twice, I stepped outside into the rain. The cold water soaked me instantly, but I welcomed it. It felt like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. I did not run, but I walked away from the house as fast as I could. I kept expecting to feel something behind me, but the further I got, the lighter I felt. By the time I reached the main road, the heavy pressure in my chest had finally eased. I went straight to a friend's place, arriving drenched and trembling. I did not tell them everything, only that something felt very wrong in my house, and I did not feel safe being alone. They let me stay the night without asking too many questions. The next morning, I returned to check the house. Everything was dry. The hallway was normal. My room was exactly how I left it. No damp marks, no strange feeling, nothing out of place. But I knew what I had felt that night. I knew I had not imagined the cold presence that followed me from room to room. And even now, whenever rain starts falling late at night, I feel a small chill creep into my chest, reminding me of that silent presence that stood so close I could almost sense its breath. I want to tell you about something that happened to me on a rainy night not too long ago. I have tried to forget it many times, but certain memories stay with you no matter how much you try to push them away. This is one of those memories. I am not sharing this to impress anyone or to sound dramatic. I just want to let it out, because keeping it in has made every rainy night feel heavier ever since. At that time, I was living alone in a small rental house at the edge of town. It was not a bad place, just a simple one-room house with a small living area and a kitchen. It was usually quiet there, which I liked, especially after long days at work. When it rained, the sound on the roof usually helped me relax, but on the night I am about to describe, the sound did not feel calming at all. From the moment the rain started, the atmosphere inside the house felt slightly off, like the air was pressing against my skin. It had been raining since late afternoon, but around evening, the rain became heavier. By the time it reached midnight, the entire neighborhood was completely silent, except for the steady sound of water streaming down the gutters. I was sitting on my bed, watching videos on my phone, trying to unwind. But even with my attention on the screen, I kept feeling this strange sense that something was not quite right. Every few minutes, I would catch myself looking away from my phone and scanning the room, even though nothing had changed. It was not fear exactly, just a slow, creeping discomfort, like the calm inside the house did not belong to the night at all. Around that time, the lights flickered a little, not enough to go out, but enough to change the brightness for a second. I remember pausing, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did not. The lights stayed on, but the room felt slightly darker anyway, as if the shadows had shifted a little on their own. I stood up to stretch and get a drink of water. As I walked toward the kitchen area, something caught my attention. On the floor near the small hallway, there was a faint patch of moisture. It looked fresh, like someone had dripped water there a moment earlier. I stopped right away, because I knew I had not brought anything wet inside the house. I had not stepped outside since the afternoon, and the windows were all closed. I moved a little closer to take a better look. The rest of the floor was completely dry, just that one patch. And for some reason, seeing that patch gave me a quiet, sinking feeling in my stomach, the kind you get when you know something is wrong but cannot explain why. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had spilled something without noticing. Maybe it was just humidity forming in a strange pattern. I tried to believe that, but the uneasy feeling kept growing. And then I noticed something else. The faint patch of moisture was not just a single spot. It looked like the beginning of a thin trail leading deeper into the hallway. I stood there for a moment, staring at that faint trail. It was so light that if the room had been any darker, I probably would not have noticed it at all. But once I saw it, I could not look away. It stretched just a little farther into the hallway, like someone with wet clothing had taken a few slow steps before stopping. My first instinct was to check if maybe water had dripped from the ceiling. But when I looked up, the ceiling was perfectly dry. No marks, no discoloration, nothing that suggested a leak. I even placed my hand on it just to be sure, but it felt warm and dry. That was when the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. There was no ordinary explanation that made sense. Yet I kept trying to rationalize it because the alternative, whatever that alternative was, felt too strange to consider. I followed the faint trail a few steps into the hallway. The air there felt colder than the living area, but I told myself it was probably just because that part of the house rarely got enough sunlight during the day. Still, the temperature difference was sharp enough that I could feel it on my skin. The hallway led to 3 doors: the bathroom, a small storage room, and my bedroom. All of them were slightly open, the way I usually left them. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing looked out of place, but the trail of moisture continued a little farther, stopping right near the entrance to my bedroom. I stood there quietly, listening to the rain outside. It sounded steady and rhythmic, but distant somehow, almost like I was hearing it through a thick layer of fabric. The house felt too still, too controlled, as if every sound inside it had been softened or held back. I leaned forward slowly to look into the room. The lights were still on, but the hallway seemed to absorb some of the brightness, making the opening of the room feel dimmer than it should have been. I could see part of my bed, part of the desk, part of the floor. Everything looked untouched, but the patch of moisture near the entrance to the room was fresh, clear, darker than the rest of the floor. It felt like someone had been standing there only moments earlier. I did not step inside. I just kept observing from the doorway, trying to understand what I was actually looking at. My heartbeat grew a little louder in my ears, but I kept telling myself to be logical. Maybe I had walked through that area earlier without remembering. Maybe my clothes had been damp and I had left marks without realizing it. But the truth was, I had not stepped near that part of the house all evening. I stayed there for a while, unsure if I should turn on more lights or just go back to the living area and pretend nothing was wrong. But the silence inside the house felt heavier by the second, like the walls were quietly waiting for me to react. Then something else caught my eye. The faint trail that had led into the hallway now looked a little clearer, not longer, just sharper, as if the moisture had become more visible in the last few moments, almost as if something had passed through again. I took a slow step backward when I noticed how the trail seemed sharper than before. It was a small change, barely noticeable at first, but once I saw it, a cold feeling spread across my chest. It reminded me of the way a mirror looks when someone has just breathed on it. Subtle, but undeniable. I stood still in the hallway, trying to keep my breathing steady. The air around me felt heavier, almost like it was holding something I could not see. The rain outside continued falling steadily, but the sound no longer reached me in the same way. It felt distant, muffled, almost unreal. I looked toward my bedroom again. The door had not moved. Everything looked exactly the same, but the feeling that someone had been standing right there, in that dim spot by the entrance, would not leave my mind. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to remember every detail of the evening. Had I stepped there earlier? Had anything wet touched the floor? I knew the answer was no, but I kept asking myself anyway, hoping for some harmless explanation. I finally forced myself to take a few slow steps back toward the living area. As I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though I told myself not to. I felt like if I looked away for too long, something might change again. When I reached the living room, I sat down on the sofa and wrapped my blanket around myself. My hands felt cold, even though the house was not usually that cool at night. I tried turning on the television again, hoping the light and sound would help distract me. But the moment it lit up, the screen flickered for a second before settling. The brief change of brightness made the room feel strange, like the shadows had shifted again. I could not relax. No matter how much I tried to focus on the screen, my attention kept drifting back to the hallway. I kept imagining someone standing there quietly, hidden in the dim space where the light did not reach fully. I did not see anything, but the feeling would not leave me alone. After a few minutes, I stood up again. I told myself I needed to double-check the house, just so I could finally calm down. Maybe if I walked through each room, I would see something simple that I had overlooked. Something that would explain everything. But when I stepped toward the hallway again, the air felt colder than before. Not like a draft. More like the kind of coldness you feel when someone stands too close without touching you. It made the back of my neck tense up immediately. I looked down at the floor. The trail had changed again. It did not lead farther, but it looked slightly darker, almost as if the moisture had just been disturbed by movement. The patch at the entrance of my bedroom looked a little larger too, like someone had been standing there longer than before. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. I did not want to get any closer, but I knew I could not keep pretending I was imagining everything. I had to decide what to do next, and I had to do it quickly, because the longer I stood there, the more it felt like something unseen was standing with me in that narrow hallway. And then I realized something that made my breath stop for a moment. The temperature around me was dropping in a way that felt unmistakably intentional. After that night, I never looked at my house the same way again. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that everything I saw was just from exhaustion or stress, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The atmosphere in my room stayed uncomfortable for weeks. Even on clear days, it felt like something was still hanging in the air, almost like the memory of that rainy night refused to fade. I tried sleeping with the lights on. I tried playing music to make the room feel warmer. Nothing helped. Each time the weather changed and the sky grew heavy, I felt the same feeling return, like I was being observed again. I kept telling myself that rain was just rain, and that it didn't mean anything. But my body reacted before my mind could even think. My hands would tense up, and my breathing would slow like I was waiting for something I didn't want to see. What scared me the most was how real everything felt. It wasn't that dramatic kind of fear you see in movies. It was more like the quiet realization that something had been right beside me, calm and patient, as if it had every reason to be there. I never saw that figure again. But sometimes when I look at the window on a cold night, I remember its shape in the reflection, standing so close behind me. I eventually moved out, telling my family it was because of work and convenience. I never shared the real reason. Even now, every time the rain starts late at night, I feel that old weight in my chest. I try to ignore it, but there's always this thought in the back of my mind, whispering that maybe it wasn't just a one-time thing. Maybe some moments follow us quietly, waiting for the right night to return. And honestly, I'm still afraid of finding out whether that night was the beginning or the only time it happened.